Math 1108, Test 3 Review Sheet, Section 8.8, Square Roots of Negative Numbers. In Part A, we have the square root of negative 36. As a reminder, we're using this definition. The square root of negative 1 is replaced with the lowercase I, and it's referred to as the imaginary unit. There's nothing magical about it. I think it was probably just done for convenience. Instead of writing the square root of negative 1, replace that with I. Okay, so we'll just use properties of square roots. The square root of negative 36, you can think of that as the square root of negative 1 times 36. And then using the product property of square roots, the square root of negative 1 times 36 is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 36. We will replace the square root of negative 1 with I, and the square root of 36 is just 6. So this simplifies to 6I. With a little bit of practice, you'll be able to tell just by looking what it's going to simplify to without writing much for intermediate work. The next one, the square root of negative 121. Well, if you want, you can think of this as the square root of negative 1 times 121. And then using the product property of radicals, this is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 121. Replace the square root of negative 1 with I, and the square root of 121 is just 11, so this just simplifies to 11I, 11 times I. Okay, the next one's a little more involved. This one is the square root of negative 75. So let's write it as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 75. And then we'll do a couple of things here. 75 is not a perfect square. The largest factor of 75 that is a perfect square is 25, and 25 times 3 is 75. So in the next step, I'll replace the square root of negative 1 with I, and we'll rewrite the square root of 75 as the square root of 25 times 3. And the square root of 25 is 5, so I'll just write this as 5 times I times the square root of 3. Okay, in the next example, the square root of negative 32. Well, this is the square root of negative 1 times 32, which is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 32. The largest factor of 32 that's a perfect square is 16. 16 times 2 is 32. So this next step, I'll replace the square root of negative 1 with I, and rewrite the square root of 32 as the square root of 16 times 2. And the square root of 16 is 4, so we can write this as 4 times I times the square root of 2. The square root of negative 45. Well, I'll do this one a little bit differently. Think of this as the square root of 45 times the square root of negative 1. And then the largest factor of 45 that's a perfect square is 9. 9 times 5 is 45. So you can think of this as the square root of 9 times 5 times I, because I'm replacing the square root of negative 1 with I. And the square root of 9 is 3, so we get 3 times the square root of 5 times I. So this is a perfectly fine way to write it. There's one pitfall to watch out for. if you put the I to the right of a square root, you have to make sure that you don't put I inside the square root. So to be safe, sometimes we just put the factor I in between the integer coefficient and the square root. But either way is fine. Okay, the last one, the square root of negative 252. So you could think of that as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 252. Okay, and we will replace the square root of negative 1 with I. And the largest factor of 252 that's a perfect square is 36. 7 times 36 is 252. So I'll rewrite the square root of 252 as the square root of 36 times 7. Okay, then we can write this as I times the square root of 36 times the square root of 7. The square root of 36 is 6, and it's more customary to put the non-radical integer factor to the left of I, and so it's 6I times the square root of 7.